It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Andy. So I can't introduce Andy without giving away his story. So I'm going to let Andy tell his story himself, but I will tell you that we're all inspired by his love for his daughters, particularly his daughter Stella, which inspired him to be a scientist at CCTDI. So without further ado, Andy.
Thank you, Charles. Okay, so my name is Andy Woods, and the title of my talk today is How I Became a Full-Time Scientist for My Daughter's Cancer. So currently I am a staff scientist at CCTDI, and this will be a presentation on kind of how I got there. It was sort of a very non-traditional route. So with that, we'll plunge in. Okay, so really my story is actually Stella Blue's story. So this is Stella here. This is kind of a little bit of a painful picture for me to look at, but there it is. This is our first day at the hospital at Seattle Children's. I think my wife and I look very nice and are smiling, but those are very forced smiles. And of course, poor Stella here is just coming out of a 13-hour surgery, so she does not look all that happy. And then we have little baby Soren, who's all like 6 days old at this point in time. She's kind of like, what's going on? So to back up, I guess I just want to, I'm going to leave this slide up here for a little bit, but I want to sort of tell the story of kind of how we got here, and then maybe go like a little further, and then talk about some specifics of what you guys can do in the world of childhood cancer. And I guess I'd just say that I hope this presentation is fun. I think it's been a really intensive week for you guys, and you still have a couple more intensive days. But I love giving this presentation because I think of it as it's story time, right? So there's no pressure here. So let's take an hour and just kind of relax and have fun, and then you guys can get back into it. And I also hope that you find it inspiring and empowering, and I think I personally always think, I'm a good example of if I can do it, anybody can do it. And I think that all you people in this room, just the fact that you're here makes you special, and you can do similar things. So anyway, we were a young family. I moved to Bozeman, Montana in 2002 and met my wife, or my future wife at that time, in 2005. And we had a pretty good life. It wasn't totally smooth, but life was pretty good. And basically I had been a carpenter for many years, was working in the construction business, living in a beautiful area. Bozeman's an amazing place. And life was pretty good. And so I did carpentry for many years, and then ended up working for a builder who did tile and stone masonry, and that sort of became my passion in life. I loved doing stone work. I still miss it to this day, parts of it. My back and knees are a lot happier as a scientist than as a tile guy. But that was it. And then Stella was born in 2007, running the business. Sort of shortly before this picture, running a business, had just given birth to Soren, had just bought our first home, which was a log cabin up in the woods outside of Montana. Life was pretty good. A few months prior to this, Stella had been starting to complain about, she called it her crampies. So one of the challenges of dealing with young children in the pediatric cancer is they have a hard time communicating what's going on. So Stella's 4 years old, and she's saying, "Oh, I have these crampies, and I don't know what they are," and they were very fleeting. They'd come and go, and she'd have sort of some weird feeling down there. Just for a few minutes, and then she'd be fine for days, and then it kept popping up. So we went through the normal, what parents go through, like, oh, maybe she's allergic to milk, or let's try this, let's try that. Seemed to be sort of getting worse, and she wasn't, she looked kind of anemic, so we brought her into the hospital. It still took a while to diagnose her, which is pretty common in pediatric cancer, and one of the issues, right, is like no one's thinking pediatric cancer when you bring your kid into the pediatrician. And so they'll go down the road of looking at all these other things. And unfortunately, fortunately, most times pediatricians are right. It's not childhood cancer. It's something else. But unfortunately for the pediatric cancer kids, oftentimes that results in sort of delays of diagnosis and allows the disease to progress. And so sometimes it's quite unfortunate. That was a little bit the case here, where we were pretty late in figuring out exactly what it was. And so by the time we did do it was an ultrasound on her kidney, she was pretty advanced. So she had advanced to stage 4. And we didn't know it quite at that time, but she had some lung metastasis at that time too. So by the time we did figure it out, our pediatrician was like, hey, we did the scan, and there's a big tumor in there. Now, kind of interestingly, like, we're in Bozeman, Montana, and there's no pediatric cancer treatment centers in the entire state of Montana, which is a little odd. Montana's a big state, but it has a very small population. So big state, only less than 1 million people live there. And that results in very few kids that are diagnosed with cancer and no treatment centers. And so it was rough. Basically the pediatrician was like, look, your kid has this big tumor. It's probably Wilms tumor. We don't know, but that's the most common kidney cancer in kids. And this is kind of an emergency situation, so you have 24 hours to get to a major treatment center. Go. He said it's Denver, Salt Lake, or Seattle. And so this is, like, you can imagine, very overwhelming, and being told that you have to leave and be somewhere in 24 hours, and the whole time, I have 4 or 5 employees working and 6 jobs going, and had just bought a house and just giving birth, and then all of a sudden, everything just stopped, for us. So it was quite traumatic. And how did we decide where to go? It was kind of funny. We didn't know anybody in Salt Lake or Denver, but we knew one person in Seattle, and that was a gal that I had gone to school with like 20 years prior in Wisconsin. And I knew that we had remained kind of friends. Hadn't spoken all that much, but I knew that she was living in Seattle. And so that was our split-second decision. It's like, well, at least we know somebody in that city, so off we go. Come to find out, Seattle Children's is an amazing place, and I'm so thankful that that's where we ended up. I should skip ahead here and just mention to everyone, because I always forget this, and people wait on the edge of their seats for the whole talk, but Stella made it, and she's now 6 years cancer-free, which is really incredible, as we'll talk about, but she did make it, so. So kind of off we go, right? And thinking back, it's important to point out that I knew nothing about cancer at this point in time. Cancer had not impacted anyone in our family, even the older people. Stella was the first. Since then, interestingly, my grandfather and her great-grandfather, who is also still with us at 94 years old, he developed cancer at the same time Stella did. So he was going through treatments down in Florida as we were up going through treatments in Seattle, but that was a little later. So at this time, cancer hadn't impacted our family, knew nothing about it. The pediatrician was like, you need to find a pediatric oncologist, and that was a term that was completely foreign to me and I couldn't even pronounce, So there we are, rushed home from the hospital, threw everything in the little tiny car and headed for Seattle, and making phone calls on the way. And top priority was Seattle Children's, calling them and saying, hey, I think, we need a PD or onc something, and so they very nicely sort of guided us to the right place and said, what, you're on your way? I said, yes, and our child has cancer, and we're going to be there tomorrow, and we probably need surgery tomorrow, so it was this sort of mad scramble. Second call was to my friend Callie, which was really interesting because I was like, hey, we haven't talked in 12 years, but I'm on the way to your house. And I have a newborn baby and a kid with cancer. So can we please, stay at your place while we sort of figure out what's going on? And they, Callie and her partner Ryan, were just amazing and let us stay in their basement basically to sort of get our feet underneath us, and it kind of blossomed into this beautiful relationship, and now they're Callie and Ryan are the godparents of our children, you know, probably due to this experience. So we get to Seattle. Stella goes right into 13 hours surgery, tumor removal. There's a tumor the size of a cantaloupe in there. So they took out her kidney, the tumor in her left adrenal gland, and this is the day after surgery. So we're in shock here, basically, and sort of plunged into treatment. You know, another part of the story is, like, at this point in time, we were feeling not fortunate, but people had mentioned, you know, hey, Wilms tumor is actually a pretty curable cancer, so it sucks where you are, you know, but there's a good chance she's going to make it through. So Wilms is probably overall 90 to 92% curable, so pretty good shot. Unfortunately for us, they took the tumor out, sent it to pathology, and it took a couple weeks for the results to come back. But after everyone had reviewed it, they diagnosed her as having the anaplastic subtype of Wilms tumor, and the vast majority of those kids don't survive. So she had all the sort of bad things, you know, it's like advanced disease, metastasis, and the anaplastic subtype. So that was kind of devastating to get that news. But again, we sort of got the news and just said, well, we're just going to beat it. Stella's a special kid, and we're just going to go through it. Oftentimes people ask me, you know, like, how do you come to be a scientist, or how, you know, they look at sort of the accomplishments I've done in the field, and they think, you know, like, wow, you must have just plunged right in, you know, and you must be really smart, you know. And to both those things I say, well, not really, you know, like, and I'm a tile and stonemason, and at this point in time, I didn't know anything about cancer, nor did I particularly want to know anything about cancer. I just wanted to get through treatment, and we just made it a goal to move back to Montana, and that was it. And I really didn't do much as far as research or advocacy work for that whole first round. So the first round took about 9 months to go through treatment, because they knew it was an advanced case, so they treated aggressively, and it was, I think, 33 or 35 weeks of chemo, 2 weeks of radiation, and then, of course, the initial surgery and a couple surgeries after. So it was an advanced treatment protocol, and we got through it. So, you know, 8 months later, after all this experience, we were declared no evidence of disease, NED, which is 3 wonderful letters. And we moved home to Montana, and it's kind of interesting. I remember my mom actually saying, hey, you know, there's some really good, like, Facebook groups, support groups for Wilms tumor survivors, and you should get involved. And I remember saying to her, I don't want anything to do with cancer. Like, we paid our dues, we're gonna move on, you know, and hope for the best. And that was, for better or for worse, that was my attitude at that time. Unfortunately, life had different plans. So the first 3 months after moving home, we had the first set of scans after treatment, and heartbreakingly, it was already growing back in the lungs at that point in time. So looking back, not terribly surprising because of the advanced disease, and most kids with Wilms tumor, if they're going to relapse, they relapse sooner than later after treatment. So 3 months, there we were, and that was, I can definitively say that was the low point in my life, was getting that news, you know, because it really was sort of what put into my head that this was it, you know, like this was not something to just sort of put behind you and move on and hope for the best, but this disease was seriously trying to kill my daughter, you know, and we were convinced at that time, and people were telling us, like, look, there's not much hope here, you know, and what we're going to do is we're going to try to treat as aggressively as we can, but be prepared, you know, and those are tough words to hear. And that was sort of what led me to become interested in cancer research and cancer advocacy. So, long introduction to get to this slide, but basically, at that point, when we were going into the second round of treatment, was where I had sort of these what I call aha moments, okay? And I don't know why it took me so long. I'm slow, I guess, to come up with these.
It's a Woods trait.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, it takes a long time to get in there. But once it's in there, that's it. So what I sort of realized, and also to share part of the story, we were heading towards round 2 of treatment, and what they had proposed was a stem cell transplant. And I think many of you are probably aware of what a stem cell transplant is, but for those of you who are not, it's a very aggressive treatment strategy, and we characterize it by calling it a stem cell transplant. Really what it is a super high whopping dose of chemotherapy, and it's so much chemo that it would kill you. You know, there's no way that your body is going to recover from that. So they give you that amount of chemotherapy, you wait for a few days, you plunge into this depths that I won't go into the details of, but it's horrific. And then they rescue you back with stem cells, and they had harvested the stem cells. In this case, it's an autologous stem cell transplant. So that's when they, earlier on, before they give you the chemo, they harvest the stem cells from Stella. It's very anticlimactic. They just hook you up to a machine and circle your blood through it. It's like a dialysis machine, and there's just this little bag of blood is what it looks like, and those are the stem cells. So they did that, and then froze them, and then gave this whopping dose of chemo, and then a few days, and then they inject the stem cells back into the body, and they're blood stem cells. So this is the problem with the chemo, is it drops your blood numbers down to 0. You have no immune system, everything's wiped out, and they try to rescue you back with the stem cells. And I do say try, because that's what you're facing as a parent, where the doctors are literally saying, we're going to kill your kid, and then we're going to attempt to rescue them back. It's very scary times and decisions to make as a parent, and something we've probably all had to grapple with, or many of us in this room, but something we wouldn't wish on anybody. So, anyway, we're going into stem cell transplant, and that's where I sort of, had these aha moments, and those were, hey, my daughter's in real trouble here. This could be it. I also realized that who could be your strongest advocate? That's me, and I can't say enough about my medical team, my doctors, Seattle Children's, just everybody's amazing, and 100%, loved Stella and wanted to save her. But what I realized is hey, all these people, they got 100 patients to see, right? So how much time are they actually going to be able to spend on my daughter? And then there's me, who's just sitting there in the hospital, going through this experience. I got all the time in the world, So I really think that as smart as my doctors are and the team is, I could probably do a better job just because I got more hours to sort of focus on this problem. Another thing that became really clear, and this may be obvious at this point, was that standard treatment protocols are ineffective, and that's exactly what the doctors were telling me. We're going to treat as hard as we can, as aggressive as we can. We're going to kill your daughter, rescue her back, and then it's still not going to work, So we're going to try, but probably not. So to me, the next logical conclusion is, hey, if the old stuff and the old protocols is not going to work, you got to go out and look for new approaches. So that's what I decided to do. And of course, all those things, and you ask yourself, when you're in that position, you say, well, how do I actually do that? And this is a stopping point for a lot of people, right? Because you don't have any experience in the cancer world, or very limited. So how do you do all those things? So I kind of put together some bullet points of hey, this is what I actually have to do. First, I must develop a very good understanding of the disease. A lot of people say, oh, you must have gone back to school. And I never did end up going back to school. Basically, at this point in time, I was I don't have time to go back to school. I got to figure this out tonight. I got to figure out cancer in a few hours. There's no time here. So you better, just get going. Look for promising approaches, because clearly the old ones don't work. I did, sort of come up with this idea of, hey, there's power in people, right? So there's an important thing. There's power in parents, and there's power in groups of people together. So I can go out and I can learn all this, and maybe I will discover something new. But no one's going to listen to me unless I got a whole bunch of people around me all sort of saying, hey, this is a good idea and we should move forward with it. So creating a patient network is huge, and I think that's applicable possibly to some of you guys here in trying to figure out where your state of the disease is and what you need to do next. And making these patient networks and registries is really important. And then if you do find promising approaches in the science and in the literature, you got to figure out how to drive these new approaches into the clinic, which at that point in time seemed difficult, but also seemed possible to do. Now I look back and I realize, wow, I can't believe I did that, because there's entire labs, this lab included, who exist to drive new approaches into the clinic, and it's difficult for entire labs to do. So there I am as a dad thinking, well, this is what I got to do, and this, so it's a big deal. So the first thing, must understand the disease. I love this slide, and I leave it all on there all the time because those of you who know me personally know I have a personal interest in Antarctica. I love it there. I had an amazing opportunity to work there for 4 months in 2000, and it was literally the coolest job I've ever had. That's me being funny.
So much love too.
Yeah.
Once we get it.
Yeah. There. I saw temperatures of below 100 degrees below zero ambient while I was there. It was an amazing experience. I got to do lots of things. One of the things that I did there was fall in love with penguins. So penguins became my favorite animals. They're just adorable. So anyway, but I love this poster because to me it kind of represents like a childhood cancer family, where you're up here at first, the diagnosis, and you see this long slope that you're sliding towards, and these guys up here are like, no, I don't want to do that, and then, but, gravity takes over and you don't have a choice. And then here, you're just like, well, I got to be as graceful as possible, about this sort of plunge into it. Even though there may be a killer whale sitting down here waiting to eat you, I'm still going to do my best, and I also like those of you that were at, I can never say his last name, so I'm just going to call him Joel, but at Joel's talk yesterday, he talked about plunging in, just diving in, and, even people like at his level, which is very high, they need some encouragement and they need courage to jump into new things. And so that's ultimately what it is. And of course, it's very motivating when you think your kid's going to die. You're just going to plunge in. So that's it. And ways to plunge in and learn about the disease, read. That's the thing. And we live in an amazing age, and it's the amount of information out there available to us is incredible, and we've never had a point in human history where we have so much material at our fingertips, and that's incredible, So it's out there. You can figure out the disease on your own. It's not easy. I do remember sort of the first few journal articles, reading them and just sort of laughing to myself and being like, this isn't even English. Like, what language is this? None of this makes sense. Like, maybe understand 1% of what's going on in a paper, maybe, okay? But when you're on a mission and you have to learn the disease, my strategy was just to get to the end of that paper, be utterly confused, and go back to the beginning and read it again. And then after the second time, I'd still be utterly confused. I'd just go back and read it again. And I'm like, okay, after the 50th time, I'm going to understand like at least enough to sort of wrap my head around. And that's very much what I did. And I'm much better at it now because I've read thousands of papers. But I still use the technique to this day. If I get through a thick Cell article, I don't understand a lot of it, and I'll just go back to the beginning and read it again. And it's amazing how the brain works, you know, and that you can totally not understand anything, and then you just repeat it to yourself over and over again, and suddenly these concepts sort of become apparent. And then also, of course, there's little tricks along the way to sort of teach yourself, like Wikipedia. You know, I can remember literally Wikipediaing in vivo and in vitro because I didn't know what the difference was, and I had to sort of teach myself, which is really funny looking back. Now this is very basic stuff, but that's where I was at. So I used the internet. Also, I always like to share this story is I didn't even have a computer at this point in time. I lived a pretty simple lifestyle, we'll call it that, before that, and I wasn't interested in computers and all that, and now it's like you can't peel me off a computer, and I'm somewhat savvy, you know, with things. But at that time, didn't have a computer, but the hospital had a computer lab, so I realized, you know, that this was going to become important. There's also other resources besides the internet. There's real books. Remember those? So you can go to the library and read books. Hospitals have libraries, so I quickly found the hospital library at Seattle Children's and was there all the time. You also, you know, for us, we were going through the experience, so you're right there, you have clinical experience, and you have doctors that you have appointments with every day, so you can pick their brains. I think some of my doctors came to dread when we were going to show up, because I would show up for the appointments and I have this laundry list of things that I had read last night, you know, and wanted to get some sort of explanation about, and they're just like, okay, Andy, you know, like we could talk for hours, but we don't have that time. So yeah, all those things can be done. So looking for promising new approaches. We talked about the internet, but I'll just mention briefly Google Scholar. There's also PubMed, which is a really nice platform, but it doesn't quite have the ease of the Google sort of interface. And so just to let you know, for those that don't know about Google Scholar, Google Scholar is a pretty amazing place. It's essentially a Google search engine, but that just pops up journal articles. And so when I first started thinking about researching cancer, I thought, okay, go to the internet. But we all know that there's a lot of junk on the internet, right? And so how can I tell, like, how can I weed out what's real and what's not real? And then I kind of stumbled upon Google Scholar, and I thought, aha, this is really a cool place, because in my mind at that time, it was like, this weeds out, you know, 90% of the crap that's on the internet, and this is like the real deal. Come to find out, it's a lot of journal articles, a lot of good science. There's some questionable journals too that have low impact ratings and probably publish stuff that's not, that could be more rigorous, we'll say that way. But at that time I was unaware of that, so I was pretty excited about Google Scholar. I also kind of decided that conferences were an important thing, and we'll talk a little more about that later, because they are. I think one of the best things you can do is attend conferences as a patient parent. And I remember sort of the first few conferences I went to, I was like, what, I'm gonna have to sneak into these things, you know, like I'm a parent and there's all these doctors, and how am I even gonna get into these conferences? Come to find out, it sort of used to be that way, where you used to have to sneak in, but not so much anymore. I don't get that sense. There are closed meetings, but the conferences are pretty much open to anybody, and there's been this sort of embracing of patients and parents, you know. So I think, generally speaking, people are really open to patient parents going to conferences, and it's an amazing networking tool, you know. That's the thing. And at first I was like, well, should we go to these things? Is that me just going on vacation to some place, you know, and sort of looking at lectures, or am I actually going to get stuff done? And again, we'll talk about it more, but you really can network, and I encourage you to go to conferences, and also, before you go, write a sort of schedule for yourself. Schedule the presentations that you're interested in, you want to go to. Also schedule meetings. So there should be no idle time at conferences. It's just go, 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 go. Sometimes my wife gets a little jealous of me traveling and going to these conferences, and I'm like, honey, you don't want to do it. It's just nonstop work for me is what I make it, and it's just meeting after meeting after meeting. But everybody's there, you know, like your doctors are there, and it's such an easy email to write, hey, are you at ASCO? Do you want to meet, you know, Thursday at noon upstairs, you know, like it's, and people are very responsive to that, so because they're there right there. So also going right along with that, communicate with researchers, doctors, other patient advocates. So some of the bigger conferences actually have like set aside rooms for patient advocates, so it's kind of a good place to network. The next point, network of patients and families. So we talked about this a little bit before, so I'll just skim over it. But basically, stronger together as a team, and also, you know, parents and families are motivated. Those are the people that really make a difference and really want to save their children. So those are the people you should be networking with. So this requires a little bit of story time. So this is when I was sort of researching, like, hey, maybe there's got to be some better treatment options out there. One, I didn't even know if we were going to be able to find anything interesting. But I was learning cancer and reading journal articles. And so basically it's a little bit of a miracle. So on the day of Stella's stem cell transplant, so she had gotten this whopping dose of chemo, and they were putting in the stem cells to sort of rescue her back out of that. And to paint the picture, we were in this small little room. Things were very chaotic. There's nurses and doctors going everywhere. Everybody's watching Stella. It was just kind of a crazy time. And then, of course, I have Soren, you know, on my shoulder, and she's getting fussier and fussier and fussier. And finally, I sort of hit this point where I was like, okay, everything seems to be sort of under control here. My wife's here. I'm going to take Soren for a walk around the hospital. I was famous at Seattle Children's because we had this little baby, you know, and so she's a healthy baby, so everybody's kind of gawks around her and stuff. But she was very fussy. She cried a lot when she was a kid, and the only thing that would stop her from crying was me walking her around. So I'd put her on my shoulder and I'd walk. So I became the guy with like the big beard and the Carhartts that was walking this little tiny baby, and I would walk miles, you know, all day, every day around the hospital. So anyway, we're at this point, and I'm like, I'm gonna go take Soren for a walk. We walk around the hospital. She falls asleep on my shoulder right near the computer lab, and I think, okay, here's a little time I'll get on the computer. And I just, the other cool thing about Google Scholar is you can search by date and time. So my whole thing was, hey, let's find what the newest and greatest research is in Wilms tumor. So I would search, you know, I put in the search engine, what came out today or what came out this week in Wilms tumor. And so sure enough, I sat down, typed in, hey, what came out today in Wilms tumor? And this paper rose to the top. And we'll just go through the long, complicated title. So it's called The Isolation and Characterization of Renal Cancer Initiating Cells from Human Wilms Tumor Xenografts Unveils New Therapeutic Targets. And I just thought, wow, you know, I don't know what that means, but it sounds really exciting, and it may be exactly what I'm looking for. And so I printed off the article, brought it back to the room, set it on the bed. And of course, Andrea, my wife, was like, what's that? You know, and I said, that's something that could be really exciting for Wilms tumor, so I'm going to learn it. And she just kind of rolled her eyes at me like she does. And I proceeded to read the paper. I must have read that thing easily 100 times. And I got more and more excited about it every time I read it. And I just thought, man, this is really cool. And basically, it was the first time anyone had characterized the stem cell for Wilms tumor. And I had to learn the stem cell theory, which in a 2-second snippet is basically all tumors are made up of a whole bunch of different cells. Some of those cells are small and resistant, and those are the stem cells. And those cells have the potential to grow up all the different cells in a tumor. And so thinking back at what had happened to us, we had had this big tumor, we took it out, we went through all this treatment, it killed everything that you could see. but clearly there was a few cells missed, and those cells were able to grow up into the relapsed tumor. So it just sort of fit exactly with our experience. And I thought, man, if we could have targeted those stem cells in the first place, then we wouldn't be in this position with relapse. And so I thought, you know, we're going through treatment again. I don't want to miss those stem cells again. Here's this nice paper which names the stem cell, CD56, or NCAM1, and they named a target there. They named a drug that targeted it. And that perhaps was their mistake in the paper, because to me it was like, aha, there's the name of a drug that does exactly what I want, you know. And so it became my mission in life to get that drug into a clinical trial for Wilms kids, which again is a very lofty sort of undertaking, but I maybe was naive and I just thought, I'm going to figure out how to get this done anyway. So went in a lot of wrong directions because I had no idea how to do something like that, but it basically eventually stumbled my way onto figuring out how to do such a thing. And there's a couple interesting things about it. So this paper came out from a group of Israelis. I read the paper a million times and then thought my first step would be to contact the authors. Didn't really expect a response. Wrote a 10-page email spelling out like everything we had done and how, you know, we were in trouble and all the things. And this is something I've learned over the years. You never ever do that, you know, and because basically someone's going to get it in their inbox and they're going to look at this, you know, impassioned plea, and they're going to be like, well, I don't have time to read that. I want 2 sentences, you know. And so that's the rule if you want somebody to respond to 2-3 sentences top, and that's most likely to get a response. Anyway, Naomi Poet-Shakad was the lead author on it, and she very nicely took the time to read my letter, and maybe a week or 2 later responded to me, which really gave me a lot of hope. You know, I was like, okay, you know, we're getting somewhere. And also very nicely, I had asked her like 10 really hard questions, like, should I be excited about your paper? What are the flaws in your paper? Can you let me know, you know? What would you do if you had a kid with Wilms tumor? How would you get this drug? You know, where is the drug? And so all these things are very difficult questions that probably no doctor in the U.S. would answer. But Naomi, bless her heart, very much got back to me and gave all her suggestions. And so she suggested kind of things I went over before, you know, get a group of people who are interested, find out where the drug is, the drug company, and then go to the company and ask them. Sounds simple, pretty difficult to do. So growing the patient community, not that hard. We live in an age of social media, so it's relatively easy to find other people with a similar disease. It's relatively easy to share information and get people sort of excited about it. But very difficult to get the drug out of a drug company. Okay, so that's a whole different ballgame. Turns out this drug was an orphan drug. It had been shelved, basically. They had tried it several times in adult cancers, so adult non-small cell lung cancer, melanoma, and there was one other one. So they had tried it in these adults, and it had failed, and they basically shelved the drug. I kind of quickly realized, like, hey, you know, one argument that could be why it failed in adults is that it's not the stem cell for those diseases. Okay, it's just CD56 is expressed in those diseases, so they had tried the drug on it and it hadn't worked. But in Wilms tumor, now we know that CD56 is the stem cell, and so by targeting it, we have a much better chance of it working. So this was a good theory, and I had lots of people that sort of agreed with me of like, hey, might be useful. The drug company, not so much. And so it was a long sort of slog to get them to give up the drug. But basically, I knew that I couldn't do it myself, so I kind of went around and said, okay, if I could get the Children's Oncology Group on board with doing it, then the children's oncology group can go to the drug company, and they might have a better chance at getting it. It was still difficult, believe it or not, for them to do it. But essentially, that's what we did. Is I figured out who at the children's oncology group was on the renal tumor committee. Went to a conference. Like, that was kind of lucky, that they were having a renal tumor conference. They only have one every 3 or 4 years. So they did happen to have one sort of right when I was interested in this. And Jeff Dohm, very well respected Williams tumor doctor, he was the chair of the Children's Oncology Group renal tumor at that time. And I actually sent him this paper right before the conference, and I said, hey, isn't this really exciting? Don't you think we should invite the Israelis to the conference and have them present this data? And amazingly, he agreed with me. He said, this is kind of exciting, and I would like to see the team. And so then I'm emailing Naomi saying, hey, I think you should go to this conference, and I bet you're going to get an invite here any day. And you should go, and you should present your data, and I'll be there kind of supporting it. And that's essentially what happened. Naomi herself didn't actually come. She was like 7 months pregnant at the time, but she sent so her PI ended up coming, and then another gal that worked in that lab. So they came to the conference, presented the paper, and it was really exciting room to be in, because it was just like all these big up and ups, and I can drop names, but you probably don't know them all. So it's just all these people who are at very high levels of COG, NCI, CTEP, all the people in the same room that need to make this thing happen. And we all just sort of sat around the table and talked about it and discussed it, and then at the end of the day it was like, yeah, this is a great idea, and probably where we need to move towards in Williams tumor. So it took, from the time the research paper came out, it took 1.5 years to get into a clinical trial for kids. Something a timeline that still in my mind I think is too slow, and there was definitely points in that time where things were just languishing, and that became exactly what I looked for and what I would sort of not allow to happen. So I knew they were like writing the protocol for the trial, and I knew whose desk it was on, and I would wait 3 weeks or a month, and if I hadn't heard anything or a conference call wasn't called, I would email the person, and I would just like keep pushing the thing along on a lot of different levels. And despite all that, it still took 1.5 years. Everybody sort of pats me on the back and says, nice job, 1.5 years is the fastest it's ever happened to go from a research paper, especially in kids. It takes a long time, and I think we've talked about that. Maybe even Tommy's last presentation talks about how long it takes to get through the process. So we really sped it up, and it's a good example of the power of parents. Like, you want to move the dial, we all have the ability to do it. We just have to sort of figure out how to do it. And I guess this presentation is hopefully inspiring you there, and will hopefully put some concrete things in your hands of how to do that type of stuff. So after the trial started, I had several realizations. I gained quite an education about cancer, and I also developed a network of Williams tumor and also people that can make clinical trials happen. And then, me just being who I am, I had become endeared to other childhood cancer families, and I watched many of them pass away, and I watched the difficulties that they were dealing with, and I was like, I've solved a lot of those problems, or I know a lot of things now, and I know with the right people, and so I felt a sense of obligation to share all that. And also, I would say I got the bug, like that was it. I became really interested in cancer research. And how are we doing on time?
10.
10?
Good.
I'm only halfway through. So we're going to speed up this second half. So basically,
10 minutes.
I was super...
You have 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay.
Sorry.
So, super fascinated by cancer research. And it kind of dawned on me, like one way to really make a difference for these kids that suffer from diseases that are understudied would be to just say, hey, I'm going to make that the passion in my life, and I'm going to go into the lab, and I'm going to do the research. As difficult as making that happen is, I felt like that might be a promising way to make a difference. And so I met Dr. Keller actually while I was helping another family sort of navigate their daughter's cancer diagnosis. And they were a very savvy family, knew lots of people, including Dr. Keller. And so we met on a conference call. And Charles was, he was inspiring, you know, and basically said, hey, you know, we have this thing called the Pediatric Cancer Nano Course every year. And what we do is we invite, you know, communities and families into the lab, and they can shadow a scientist, and you can sort of see what's going on. And I just thought, man, that's the coolest thing I've ever heard, because I've been reading for years and years all these journal articles and reading about Western blot analysis and drug screens, but I always wanted to know, like, what does it look like? You know, what does the lab look like? What's the drug screen actually physically look like? And so the offer to come to the course, I, you know, got off the phone and immediately signed up for the course, and that was it. And then, of course, Charles isn't here, so I can say this. Like, I kind of went to that course with a hidden agenda, you know, because I had already sort of figured out, hey, I want to go work in a lab. You know, this could be a great thing. All I got to do is find somebody crazy enough to hire a tile guy in a cancer lab. And so I felt like Charles might be that guy.
Well, he said he couldn't get rid of it.
Yeah, we tell different versions of the story, but that's the real version. So, so basically, I came in, we did the course, I had a great time. I took Dr. Keller out for a couple beers to loosen him up a little at the end, and was like, hey, how would a guy like me, you know, a tile guy, sort of change his career in midlife and get into cancer research? And he said, well, you need to find somebody with a lab who will let you take a sabbatical from your tile work and do an internship. And my response was, well, when can I start? And he said, oh, no, not my lab. Like, I wasn't thinking me at all. Let's find you another lab to go into. And I said, I kind of like you, and I like your lab, and I really think this is the place for me. And so it did take a lot of persuasion, but eventually we sort of worked out a plan, and he agreed to let me come into his lab and do an internship. So there I was at 41 years old with all these like super smart 17 and 18-year-olds who were just gonna blow me out of the water. And it was kind of fun, and I literally, Noah was my mentor. Can't hear me, but he knows I'm talking about. And I said, literally, you got to teach me how to pipette, you know, physically. Like all these kids, they come in knowing all this stuff because they're in high school. They've done these things, and I haven't done anything like that in a long time. So just teach me how to move water from one dish to the next. And that was like my first task in the lab. Noah's like, okay, you want to move red food coloring from one dish to the other? And I said, yes, I have to learn this. So that was it. So basically, that's what I did. I completed a summer internship in 2016, learned a lot, had great mentorship from Noah and from Dr. Keller. Was very motivated, worked a lot, worked hard. It was a 6-week internship, and then basically that's what Charles, that's where his part of the story is. I couldn't get rid of Andy because I pretty much refused to leave. You know, I did my 6-week internship, gathered all this data, was really excited about the project. I remember sitting at the kitchen table and Charles saying, okay, your 6 weeks is up, where are you at? And I'm like, well, I got 7 cell cultures going, and I'm planning this, you know, drug screens, and he's like, spin them all down and put them in the freezer, you know, your internship is done. And I was like, well, actually, you know, I'm gonna be back in like a couple weeks. I'm gonna go home, you know, and visit the family, and then I'm going to be back in a couple weeks, and I'm going to continue it on. And he didn't have a lot of choice in the matter, and that's what I continued to do. He didn't pay me anything, but I was just motivated to get that study done, and so I just kept coming back, kept working at it, and then eventually gathered enough data to apply for some bigger grants. Was awarded those grants, and started as a full-time scientist in 2017, working on an anaplastic Wilms tumor study, which has moved along pretty nicely, but is still ongoing. In 2018, the other sort of passion in my life, which I just want to mention here because it's so important to me, Charles asked me to become involved with the CureFast, which is the tumor banking program. You probably heard me talk about it. And I'm equally fascinated by anaplastic Wilms tumor and creating study models of rare diseases, and that's what the CureFast Tumor Banking Program does. And I liked it so much that they eventually made me the study director of the program. And so basically we capture fresh tissue and develop cell cultures and mouse models out of it, amongst other things, but that's sort of the main focus. And it really is, there's diseases out there that only affect 5 or 6 kids a year, and no one studies them. And one of the reasons no one studies them is there might be interest in it, but there's no study models, so there's no cell lines, no mouse models, so nothing for scientists to work with. And CureFast is a great program that's set up and designed to create those study models. So something I'm really interested in and passionate about.
Where did you apply for your grants and get your grants from?
So 2 places, the Rally Foundation was one, and Cure. So Cure Childhood Cancer, which is an Atlanta-based organization. I applied to like 6 different ones. Also, I should mention Alex's Lemonade Stand. They gave me a small grant that allowed me to do the internship, and I love them, and I love their organization, so I just want to give them some credit. There was a question last year from a researcher in the lab, or that was here for NanoCourse, and she said, how did you get the grants? This is something that we really struggle with as scientists, and you come in as a layperson. And it was tricky, it was a lot of work, but the answer is I had a lot of help from Charles and Noah. And so I could write the grant and do everything, but really I had to have them on the grant too. And because they were my mentors, they nicely agreed to be on the grant, helped me write it, and I could put their CVs on there. So parts of grants you have to do an NIH biosketch, and my biosketch is pathetic. It's like 1 page, and it's getting better with time. But especially at that time, it's like, well, I skied in college, nothing to do with cancer research. And so being able to put Dr. Keller's CV on there and Noah's was huge for actually getting a grant.
So how did that clinical trial do? Is that drug being used?
So that drug did go into trial. It's sort of, I don't know, the way I put some positive, it basically, I can say now, it didn't work, okay? Like many clinical trials, it's disappointing to me. Fortunately, for us, Stella never needed it. She didn't have to go on the trial. She never relapsed after the stem cell transplant. So all this work I did is kind of all for naught, right? But not really. It helps all these other kids. And there were kids that needed an option, that were out of options, and they did enroll onto the trial. Unfortunately, most of those kids passed. There was one response, but it wasn't from a Wilms tumor. It was from another disease that they had enrolled onto the trial. And so there is some there's some excitement about the drug, but for Wilms tumor, we're not so excited about it. Now, I can go on and on, but basically we can look at why the drug failed, and it's a conjugated drug antibody, so there could be issues there. There's a lot of reasons, and what that means is there's a lot of potential to use the same strategy but maybe modify the drug, and people are working on that now.
So what are you working on right now?
Right now I'm focused on anaplastic Wilms tumor. And so the study, so my whole sort of pitch is, hey, we have 2 populations in Wilms tumor. One does quite well with therapy, one doesn't do well at all, but we treat them the same. We use the same drugs, but we just ramp up the dosages for the anaplastic. So that leaves the kids with the anaplasia with lifelong side effects because they've had these huge doses of chemotherapy, and most of them die anyway. So my study in the lab is, hey, shouldn't we be smarter about this, and could we find targeted therapies, and particularly a combo of targeted therapies that we should treat the anaplastic kids with? And so that's been 2 years of study of trying to find that magic sort of combination. We're not there yet. We're not there yet, but we've made a lot of progress towards getting that answer. So we're close. Yeah.
What about the role of juicing in your care of Stella?
So that's a part of the story I'm not going to talk about here. we don't have time, basically. But it was, he brings up a point that I've mentioned to him. We did do like sort of alternative approaches, because at the point where we were going into stem cell transplant, we were convinced she was going to die. We were convinced that this wasn't going to work, and we were just going to throw everything that made sense to us at it. And so I did become very interested in natural food compounds, because that's something you can control as a parent. You can control what your kid eats or what goes into your kid. And actually that was my first sort of foray into cancer research, was looking at plant compounds and how they acted against cancer. And come to find out, there's a lot of research out there, and I got really excited about that and things, but that's a whole different lecture that could go
But
on and on.
one quick question on that.
Yep.
Did you feel it was beneficial for her?
So ultimately, especially as a scientist now, I don't know. I can't answer that question. Because I always look at it and I say, okay, 98% of those kids die. Stella made it. So she's standing there in front of me. So is that because of juicing fruits and vegetables, or is it because of the stem cell transplant? And we'll never tease that out. Nor do I really care. All I care
The
about is that my
combination
daughters.
worked, right?
Yep, something worked, and that's amazing, you know. And so that's ultimately what I have. So a couple quick pictures. This is us yesterday, and everybody's smiling and happy. Soren's all grown up. Stella's looks really good there. You know, she looked poorly for years after transplant, but she looks great. I don't do a lot of construction these days, but I did build this tree house
Cool.
up there, which is super fun. And yes, it does have an elevator that the kids are in. You can see it right there going out. Charles says I'm a fun dad. And then kind of an older picture, but I always like to show it, is that's Stella pretty soon after treatment, actually, with her Beads of Courage. And if people don't know what Beads of Courage is, it's a really cool program where they give a bead for every procedure that the kid goes through. And you can see that that's just strand after strand. And if you put end to end together, it just goes around the rooms. And it really makes you realize what those kids go through. And the kids love them. And Stella actually still has her Beads of Courage in her room, and it's still like a big source of pride for her. And then I was sharing with my intern Ava here the other day. They have a sense of humor too, like the radiation beads glow in the dark. So, kind of cool. So with that, I'll wrap up. I'll do a quick thank you. This is the most recent picture I could find. It is missing a couple people from the lab, but lab team, Dr. Keller, of course, everything to him, so big thanks. And then, of course, my family for supporting my very crazy midlife career transition into cancer research. Couldn't do it without that support. I do have one quick handout that I'm gonna just pass around. You just take one and pass it. I like to put concrete ideas of like what you really can do, action points, I guess, to make a difference in pediatric cancer. And so this is my attempt at sort of putting all those points out there. Thank you,
Andy, very much.